Hello guys and welcome back to FatbossTV, Loz here, and in this video we're looking at the new Disc Priest. And in these class preview videos that we're making here on this channel, we're not going super in depth, we're just going over the new talents, the new spells, the artifact, and ultimately how everything has impacted and changed the spec. And hopefully with these videos you'll get a clear understanding of how your class may well be in summer when Legion comes out. But do note this is alpha footage, we are talking about stuff that's happening right now and things do change. This is actually the second time I'm recording this video because they have already made some substantial changes to Disc Priest. But let's get into it and let's talk about what a Disc Priest is. So over the more recent years, Disc Priests have acted primarily as your support healer, and the reason I say this is because they don't actually do that much effective healing. They've never been good at topping the raid, but what they have been good at is shielding an entire group of players before damage comes in, which allows some of the damage, if not all the damage, to be completely mitigated. And this was once done with Spirit Shell, and these days it's done simply by just spamming prayer word shield. And on top of this, they're also incredibly useful in situations where a single player is taking a high amount of damage, and you can just place Clarity of Will on top of them. This spell alone made Disc Priest completely broken on certain mythic encounters over the course of Warlords. But sadly, it appears that Blizzard are taking a completely different approach for Shield's next expansion. Holy Paladins have completely lost their mastery. You will no longer see 50% of their output simply being illuminated healing, and Disc Priests have lost their mastery, meaning you'll no longer get any significant scaling on your shields apart from spell power. In addition, your current primary spell, Prayer Word Shield, in Legion is going to have a 6-second cooldown. This means you can't just spam it mindlessly anymore. You do, however, have a new spell called Rapture. This allows you to spam shields for 8 seconds, and they have removed Weakened Soul, so you can potentially spam a shield on the same target over and over again. However, Rapture does have a 1.5 minute cooldown. So what has filled this void that Blizzard have created by significantly nerfing shields? Well, they've just given Disc Priest effective healing through Atonement. Now, Atonement has existed in the game for some time now. In Warlords, it's barely noticeable, but in Legion, it's core to your spec. How Atonement works now is that it is a buff that you apply to players through pressing other abilities. While that buff is active on that target, 50% of the damage you deal is converted to healing and placed on top of them. And this healing isn't split between all targets that have Atonement on them. It's just a flat 50% placed on every target that has Atonement on them. And the new mastery that Disc Priests have just increases this healing by a flat percent. So the fundamentals of Legion Disc Priests are keep Atonement up on players that you wish to heal, and deal damage to grant them that healing. Atonement lasts 15 seconds, but can be increased slightly through talents, and there are multiple artifact talents that actually improve your output in one way or another through Atonement, and we'll talk about them later on in the video. So how do you apply Atonement? We have a brand new spell called Plea. This is an instant cast that just heals the target for a small amount. You have Prayer Word Shield, again, no longer has Weakened Soul, but it does have a 6-second cooldown. You have a new ability called Shadow Mend. This is a single target heal with a short cast that heals for more than Plea, but it does also apply a dot to your target that lasts until they have taken a set amount of damage, and this includes the damage from the dot. So to explain this a little bit better, if you apply the heal to someone, they'll get the dot. If they don't take any damage from anything whatsoever, the dot will just tick a couple of times until it has met the threshold, and then it will drop. And if you apply it to someone that has already got a dot on them, or is maybe getting hit by a boss or an ad or something like that, the debuff will be removed almost instantly, as it will meet the damage threshold from other sources. And lastly, you have a new spell called Power Word Radiance. Now this heal is on a longer cast and heals your target and the 2 nearest targets to that player. This only applies Atonement though for 50% of its normal duration, which is only 7.5 seconds unless you have it talented. The heal from this ability is actually pretty strong, but Atonement on such a short duration isn't fantastic, and it's actually pretty irritating to have to reapply it, especially if you can't do any damage within those 7.5 seconds because you're in your situation where you need to use your GCDs for other things. I don't know, maybe like shields, or maybe you're reapplying Atonements to other targets, or whatever. And one thing to note about this spell, which is pretty important, it has completely replaced Prayer of Healing. So let's go over the damaging spells. You still have Shadow Word Pain, it's still an 18-second dot, it's still an instant cast, and you can still apply it to multiple targets. You also still have Penance. This is just your short channeled cast that deals damage over the course of the channel. It does have a 9-second cooldown, and note that you can't target players and heal them directly with this spell anymore unless you talent it. You also have Smite. This is just your short cast that deals a bit of damage, just like Live. But you do have a new passive called Revelation. This just makes it so every time you cast Smite, there's a 30% chance that you'll reset the cooldown on Penance. And there are all your damage spells. So in terms of maximum output, It appears that just keeping Shadow Web Pain on as many targets as possible, making sure Penance is on cooldown, and just spamming Smite is the way to go. And then of course, in between dealing damage, you would need to find opportunities to reapply Atonement to your desired targets. Otherwise, they won't be receiving any healing whatsoever from your damage. And in terms of reapplying Atonement, it does seem that the best time to do it is when Penance is already on cooldown. On top of these healing and damaging abilities, you still have Pain Suppression, you still have Barrier, you still have Life Grip, Normal and Master Spell, you have Fade, you have Shackle Undead, Levitate, you've got Mind Control, you also have Psychic Scream, this is no longer a talent, and you have the Focused Will passive. Everything else you expected me to mention has either been moved to another spec, is now a talent, or just no longer exists within the game. So talking about talents, let's move on. So the first line of talents, the level 15 line, is all about your Penance. The first talent allows your Penance to be cast on a single player, so you can heal them directly with that, rather than through Atonement. The healing they receive from Penance directly, rather than through Atonement, is only slightly higher, however this can be buffed with later talents. The second talent makes it so when you're casting Penance, it fires one additional bolt, so it just deals extra damage, which means more healing. And the third talent makes it so your final bolt of Penance will explode and deal AoE damage around the target, so if there's multiple targets up, this will just infuse your Atonement targets with a massive burst of healing, providing there's multiple targets. The level 30 line is very similar to Live, you still have your feathers, work the exact same way. Body and Soul, again, is the exact same, however you could argue that it's maybe slightly nerfed now, because shields have a 6-second cooldown. But there is something new on this line, which is Masochism. This makes it so when you cast Shadow Mend on yourself, it doesn't apply the dart, but it's only to yourself, it doesn't affect anyone else in your raid. So ultimately, this line isn't all that spectacular, I guess. I think in most situations, maybe you'll just go for feathers. They're probably going to be the most useful thing, especially when it comes down to raiding. Just you having that personal speed increase is probably going to be a lot more useful than the other talents there. The 45 talent line is your CC line. There's a new ability called Shining Force. When you cast this ability, it makes all enemies around your target get knocked back and also slowed for 3 minutes. So it's like a ranged thunderstorm, pretty much, and it does have a minute cooldown. Psychic Voice is a passive talent. This just simply reduces the cooldown on your Psychic Scream by 30 seconds, so it brings it down to a 30-second cooldown. And the last one is Dominant Mind. This allows you to control your own player as well as the enemy that you've mind controlled. Being able to control yourself as well as whatever mob you've mind controlled might actually be pretty decent when it comes down to dealing damage in the new challenge modes and stuff. So yeah, pretty interesting. The level 60 talents is all about your mana. So you have Solace, works exact same way, 10-second cooldown, deals damage, gives you some mana back. This doesn't use any mana whatsoever to use, and the damage you deal, of course, grants Atonement healing. You do, however, have Shield Discipline. This makes it so when your Prayer Word Shield is completely absorbed, you're just refunded 1% mana back. And you have Mindbender. This is a 1 minute cooldown and makes your Shadow Fiend go crazy and just grant mana back when it deals damage. And of course, while your Shadow Fiend is dealing damage, that is also going to grant Atonement healing. As for which one is best for mana in this line, I have no idea. I'm not going to sit down and do all the math. But for your standard fight where you want to just get consistent mana back as well as deal some damage, Solace is probably going to be the one that you'll want to take. Now, when you move on to your 75 line, the first talent is probably the most important talent out of all of them. This simply increases the duration of Atonement by 5 seconds, which is incredible. This just allows you to have Atonement up on more players. And of course, the more players that have Atonement, the more healing you're going to be doing while you're doing your damage. So yeah, pretty much the best talent here. However, on this line, sadly, you do also have Power Infusion. It works the exact same way, but it's very unlikely in a raiding situation that you'll ever take this over Atonement duration. But you also have Twist of Fate, and this is where things get slightly difficult, because it does give you a flat 20% damage and healing increase for 10 seconds, after you heal a target below 35%. And in most raiding situations, it's very likely that you're going to heal someone every 10 seconds that's below 35% health, especially towards later points in the expansion where damage is a little bit more bursty. So if you can keep like 100% uptime on this, a flat 20% damage increase is going to be really, really nice on your Atonement healing, because you'll be able to do that extra damage. Whether this talent is better than the first one, I think it's so situational. When you're in the situation where you just want loads of people to be coated by Atonement, and people aren't dropping below 35% a lot, then yeah, Twist of Fate won't be that useful. However, if people are low all the time and you want to just do that extra bit of healing and you maybe don't have that much time to constantly keep reapplying Atonements, and instead you just want decent healing on the players that already have Atonement, then yeah, Twist of Fate will be really, really strong. On the level 90 line, you have Clarity of Will still. It's still a long cast and it applies a massive shield. However, of course, the shield is still significantly weaker than it is on live because of the removal of Disc Mastery. You have Divine Star, again works the same as live, has a 15-second cooldown, instant cast, shoots out a star, fires back towards you. This actually heals for quite a large amount. It was recently buffed on the alpha. So yeah, if you are in a situation where you have a large group of players stacked, this is actually really, really nice. And the last talent is Halo, and the concept of this ability is the same. It still has a cast, and it still sends out a ring. The difference is that it doesn't matter how far away the players are. Instead, it will just heal all players for the exact same amount. And it now actually has a display showing you the exact range of the Halo, which is pretty decent. So when it comes down to this, you use Cal when you need to, if you're on a fight where maybe tank damage is absolutely disgusting and you do need that shield in order for the tank to survive. Or maybe someone has a really nasty dot, or you're on a fight like Maidens or whatever, then, you know, Cal will be king. Divine Star if you're stacked, and Halo if you're spread. Pretty simple, really. Level 100 talents, you have a new ability called Purge of the Wicked. This flat out replaces Shadow Word Pain. It's still a dot, it lasts a couple more seconds, ticks slightly harder, but it does have a 10-second cooldown. However, you can spread this dot to nearby targets by casting Penance on the target that has the dot. And when it does spread, it does reset its duration, so you can keep it up forever if you keep pressing Penance on the new target. I'll ignore the second one here, I'm going to go straight to the third one. This is Shadow Covenant. This completely replaces Power Word Radiance. It has the exact same cast time, heals the exact same way, costs slightly more mana, and heals for about double the amount, but instead of healing 2 nearby targets, it will heal 5 nearby targets. The only downside from this spell is that it also places a healing absorb shield on the targets for 10 seconds. Even with this healing absorb shield, it still heals for more than Power Word Radiance overall. And the funny thing is with this shield is that it is in fact a buff on alpha, so you can just simply click it off. On live, it's very unlikely that this will be the case. But really, the sad thing about this ability is that it feels a little bit useless, primarily because it doesn't even apply Atonement. And if that is intentional, it's very unlikely that you'll see many priests using this talent, unless the healing from it is like significantly buffed and it's just unbelievably overpowered. But yeah, we'll have to see how that one goes. And the reason why I skipped the second talent is because this one kind of changes the way that you play your class completely. So Grace increases your non-Atonement healing and absorption by 30% on targets that have Atonement. So for spot healing, this talent is unbelievably good in comparison to Atonement. I found it much easier to keep tanks healthy using Grace and just spamming shields and mend on them, rather than just the healing through Atonement. But if you're in a situation where you're in a raid, where you have more than 5 people, it's very likely that Atonement will be superior to this talent. And also to add to that, Atonement is very, very mana efficient and you heal way more targets in comparison. But one important thing to note is that, of course, this talent does increase the absorption amount on them by 30%, and this is something that I think most people are overlooking. If you're on a fight like Maidens, like I already said, where, you know, targets take lethal damage, if you can somehow make it so you have a really large shield on them, which you can with Cow and Prayer Word Shield, if you're running the Grace talent, it's going to be even bigger and it is likely to keep them alive. And this also applies to tanks as well. If you're on a fight with Impale style mechanics like you saw in Deathwing, this is going to help you out a shit ton. So potentially Grace might get some use in raids, but it does completely change your healing style. Of course, you can still do Atonement. There's nothing to prevent you from doing Atonement healing. But if it is a fight where you are purely aiming for Atonement healing, it's likely that you're just going to be running with Purge of the Wicked instead. So let's move over and talk about the artifact. Now, the weapon itself has 2 passives. One of them makes it so when you cast a holy spell, there's a chance that you will just get increased healing to all players that have Atonement. Just extra free healing, that's it. And the other passive makes it so when you cast shadow spells, there's a chance that you'll get a buff that increases your direct damage by 3% every second for 10 seconds. So when this procs, you just want to spam Penance and smite as much as you possibly can. When it actually comes down to the tree, the first ability you'll get is something called Light's Wrath. This ability has a longish cast that just deals flat damage to your target, and the more targets in your raid that you have Atonement on, the more damage this ability deals. The damage you deal with this ability doesn't actually seem to heal Atonement targets, which I think is really sad. I think it would be really nice if they changed this, because it would act as some form of like mini cooldown every 1.5 minutes that just bursts Atonement targets with extra healing, because although it doesn't do that much damage, if you have loads of targets with Atonement, if you say have 10 or 15 people with Atonement on them, this ability is going to heal for a fucking shit ton. And I think that's nice. I think that'd be cool. As for everything else that's within the artifact tree, the majority of them are just passives, But the really great thing about the Disc Priest one is that all of the passives are decent. If you have a look at some of the other classes, some of their talents within the artifact just seem really pointless. Disc is very much the opposite. Pretty much all of them are useful in one way or another. So like I said, the majority of them are flat increases. You know, you can get damage increase on penance, your atonement heals for 100% more of the targets inside your barrier, you deal 1% more damage for each person that has atonement on them. That's probably the best one here, to be honest. When you apply atonement to a target, the next cast time of your penance or smite is reduced. There's one that just simply increases the damage of smite. There's one that makes it so when Shadow Word Pain ticks, there's a chance penance will do 100% bonus damage the next time you use it. Pain suppression cooldown reduced, Raptor cooldown reduced, increased absorption on Prayer Word Shield by a flat percentage, as well as making it so when you apply it, a percentage of that is also applied to yourself. Shadow Mend has a chance not to apply the dot on cast, Radiance output increased, and damage taken reduced. Everything there is good. There's nothing bad at all. So that's everything to do with your class talents as well as your artifact talents. Let's wrap this up and let's talk about where this Disc Priest is, what do we think, and how strong is it? So ultimately, if you use the talent to increase the duration of Atonement, you can have Atonement up on a large group of players, and if you're clever with who you decide to cast Radiance on, you can also have people coated within a quicker time frame. And in the situation where the raid is taking ticking damage, this is pretty much flat out broken. Pain ticks and penance casts being used on cooldowns, as well as adding smite wherever you can with 10 or more targets with atonement buffed, is really sick healing. However, for 10 plus targets, this does mean that at least half of your global cooldowns will be used to apply atonement, but it's still easily tracked and it's easily done with or without Radiance. So that brings us to Prayer Word Shield, Plea, and Shadow Mend. I don't think you'll ever use Shadow Mend as something that you'd use to apply atonement. It's more like a panic style spot heal that just so happens to also apply atonement. I think it's likely the majority of the time that when you're using Prayer Word Shield, it's going to be used on cooldown on your tanks. They're going to have atonement more or less permanently anyway, and for the rest of the time, you're actually going to be coating the raid using Plea. Plea does heal for a very small amount, but it is an instant cast and does apply a 20-second atonement buff, providing you're using the talent. And Plea costs virtually no mana whatsoever, so it's probably the best way of doing it. But of course, you do need to find a balance, because if you just apply Atonement all the time through you just spamming Plea, but you're doing absolutely no damage, then you're going to be doing no healing as well. So while you're playing the new disc, you've got to be constantly thinking about who your priority targets are for Atonement, while just weaving in penances, keeping up Shadow Word Pain, and then using Smite as a filler, or just weaving in Pleas to keep more Atonements up. So is it strong? In my opinion, yes, it is strong. If you're able to do significant damage and manage your atonement buffs properly, you'll just be doing great raid healing. And ultimately, a healer that keeps everyone alive, but is also doing good damage, is much more useful than a healer that is simply just keeping people alive. And then to add on top of that, Disc Priest still has Barrier, still has Pain Suppression, two spells that are being incredibly useful in the raiding scene for a long time, and I think that's very unlikely to change. But the harsh reality really of the class so far in Alpha is that it doesn't produce amazing healing, especially in the earlier stages of your artifact, and also with the poor gear itemization that you have on pre-made characters. The healing that you deal through Atonement, I found generally wasn't enough to keep the entire group up or the tank up while doing some of the 5-mans, which kind of forces you to spot heal with Shadow Mend, and Plea and Shadow Mend don't heal for very much whatsoever, so having to spam like 10 Shadow Mends to top your tank after a trash pack isn't really all that satisfying. It's just frustrating. If you run the Grace talent, this makes spot healing significantly easier, you get the extra 30%, but I don't think that's what they want you to do. I mean, to stress this clearly, the class isn't scaled properly. The dungeons are, well, some of them are pretty overtuned, and some of the tanks are pretty weak. So people do die, and Disc isn't the best at topping people. And as well as the gear having virtually no bonus mastery whatsoever. And of course your mastery is going to be important because it increases your atonement by a flat percentage. There's also a lack of intellect on a few pieces, which of course doesn't help either. That's just lowering your overall healing. But scaling and outputs aside, how does the disc feel in comparison to the live server disc? Well, it depends what you like, really. I mean, I feel like while you're progressing as a Disc Priest on live servers right now, you're so incredibly powerful. If you're quick to react and shield the right targets at the right time, you're easily the most useful healer. And the reason why I say that is because you can easily save lives. A Disc Priest is the safety net of the raid. If someone's an idiot and stands in the fire for too long, you just place a shield on them and their mistake is pretty much covered by you. And in some circumstances, you can literally make or break encounters. However, shielding, from the eyes of most healers it seems, is annoying and makes healing become sort of more boring for those who don't have the ability to negate all the damage coming in by spamming a single button. I think this problem really only exists on farm, and I must admit, while we're doing our weekly clear on a Wednesday in Hellfire Citadel, I prefer to heal without a disc or a paladin, because both of those classes simply do limit the other non-shielding healers. I think with shields now having a cooldown introduces a whole new level of play, where the priest has to make a decision every 6 seconds where the shield is best placed. It's likely that the majority of the time that shield is best placed on your tanks, but with hard-hitting dots or other abilities that other players need to deal with in certain situations, it could be best to be placed on someone else, and it might even be worth sitting on it so you time it perfectly. And of course with Rapture you do have the option to pre-shield a selection of your raid before damage comes in, or even just spam a shield on a single target because Weakened Soul no longer exists, but then again Rapture does have a long cooldown so you can't do it all the time. So if you're a non-disc priest that are completely fed up with shields, you're going to love the new disc priest because they're not going to screw your healing over anymore. However, if you're a hardcore disc priest that loves having the ability to salvage a player from their mistakes simply by shielding them, well, you're still going to be able to do it, just nowhere near as frequently or effectively as you are doing it right now on live servers, which I guess is a bummer for you guys. Now, in terms of Atonement, it's really easy to manage in a 5-man situation, but I can imagine it being very frustrating in a raid. And to be honest, I really wish that Radiance would heal a group just like Prayer of Healing instead of just healing the closest targets to that player. But as I pointed out earlier, I don't think Radiance is that necessary. A good Disc Priest will still be able to keep good Atonement uptime just by weaving plea between their damaging spells. I think damaging to heal as a concept, originally with Atonement, I think was extremely counterintuitive, especially during Mists of Pandaria. But in Legion, with Atonement being a buff that you have to control yourself, it makes it feel way more involved. You feel like you're actually doing something. And I also think it actually raises the skill cap on the class quite highly. I think you're going to see a vast difference between a good and a bad Disc Priest, with your best Disc Priest being able to do significant damage, as well as keeping a good balance of Atonement targets. And on top of that, as well as being able to actually save people using shields, or simply reduce the damage of a certain ability on someone. But where do they fit in within a raid team now? Well, that's the question, I think. I mean, Paladins and Discs have always had a spot within a raid team, especially over the past few expansions, because they both do very unique jobs in comparison to, say, the other healers. It does appear that Paladins are going to keep their job as tank healer. They're not available right now in the alpha, but you can see simply just by looking at their abilities that they're very much focused on tank healing still. However, Discs, with their shields being significantly nerfed, they sort of fit in more with your raid healers now, so they're with your monks, your druids, your shamans, and your holy priests. And holy priests have seen some pretty significant changes. Again, they're not available, but with the changes, I'm not going to refer to them again as it's sort of a different discussion for another time. So the question is, if a Disc Priest can do equal healing to a monk, a shaman, or a druid, while maintaining a higher damage output than the other healers, then why the hell would you bring the other healers to the raid? And the only reason I can think of is that Revival, Healing Tide, and Trank are actually needed for one reason or another, as well as Spiraling Totem. But in a recent patch, they did actually nerf all the output CDs pretty damn hard. And to add, Disc Priests still have Barrier, and although it's not always as strong as any of the output cooldowns, Barrier is usually just as useful, and in some situations, it's flat out better. And to top that, of course, you still have your shields every 6 seconds and pain suppression. But I think the real question you need to ask is, what if Disc Priests do not do equal healing to a monk, a shaman, or a druid? And although they may well be doing damage, what if the healing that they're sharing out from dealing their damage simply isn't high enough? The solution to that really is, well, you're not going to see any Disc Priests in raids unless like Barrier, Cow, or Shields every second is a flat out requirement for that particular encounter. Then again, we still don't really know how healing is going to be in Raid's next expansion. So far, we've only ever seen 3 bosses, and they've all had very different healing styles and requirements. If you see encounters where constant damage is going out on over half your raid, Priests are going to be awesome because they're going to be able to keep that constant stream of healing on the majority of those targets all the time. However, if it's bursty or targets need to be topped quickly, Disc Priest is pretty poor because they're not going to be able to top people as quick as a monk or a shaman. Maybe that ultimatum is a little bit harsh and borderline over-dramatic, but that's just how I feel. I honestly think that's the situation here, and I think that is what they need to work out. But apart from that, I mean, I like the changes they've done to Disc Priest. I think it makes sense. I think it's kinder to the rest of the healers. It makes more sense. It is going to be less frustrating for the other healers, but I feel like they've taken quite a lot away from the more hardcore Disc Priests, the ones that actually like to be in a position where they can act as a safety net. It being on a 6-second cooldown, I don't think is the problem. I think it's just the actual strength of the shield itself. On Alpha right now, it doesn't feel particularly large. If they made it so the absorb effect on it was much bigger, I think it would have more of an impact within a raid, and I think more hardcore disc priests could still feel like they are that safety net for the idiot that is standing in the fire for too long. But that's all we've got time for in this video, guys. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this little preview, please do drop us down a like, and let us know in the comments what class you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next one.